It was a radiant morning in St. Mary Mead, the sort of spring Sunday that made even the most cantankerous of parishioners hum a hymn under their breath. The hedgerows were newly green, and the faint scent of lilac drifted from the vicarage garden toward the small ancient church where the choir gathered for rehearsal. Mrs. Price Ridley had, as usual, taken her position at the front pew, her spine as straight as a poker, and her voice as sharp as vinegar. Colonel Melchett, attending more out of marital obligation than piety, sat 2 rows behind, attempting to conceal his yawns behind the hymn book. Young Gladys Weatherby, the new schoolteacher with ambitions of refinement, hovered near the organ, adjusting her hat and glancing nervously toward the choir master, Mr. Edwin Tupper. Mr. Tupper was a man of rigid habits. Every rehearsal began at precisely 10 minutes past 10, for he believed punctuality to be next to godliness, if not above it. His immaculate cuffs and thinning hair lent him the air of a man who had once expected more from life, and perhaps resented that it had not obliged. By 1:15, the church was filled with the usual sounds. Voices rising and falling, Miss Hartnell complaining that the altos were overpowering her, and Mrs. Price Ridley insisting that the sopranos were flat. Only one voice was missing, that of Mr. Arthur Symes, the village's postmaster, and the choir's baritone. "Arthur Symes is never late," Miss Hartnell remarked pointedly, folding her hands. "He's a man of precision, unlike some." There was a murmur of agreement, quickly smothered when Reverend Clement entered. His gentle smile did little to disguise his irritation. "Let us begin without him," he said mildly. Perhaps something detained him. It was only at the end of the second hymn that something truly had detained Mr. Symes, though none of them knew it yet. When rehearsal ended, the villagers spilled into the sunshine, chatting in small, clucking groups. Miss Marple, who had been quietly knitting in the back pew, she claimed the organ practice soothed her, stepped out last, nodding politely to each passer-by. Her blue eyes, still sharp as pins, swept over the scene. Gladys Weatherby's pale face, the vicar's anxious frown, and Mrs. Price Ridley's satisfied air of having survived another morning surrounded by inferiors. A sudden shout shattered the peace. It came from behind the church near the small copse of birches that bordered the graveyard. "Good heavens!" cried Reverend Clement, running toward the sound, cassock flapping. The others followed, curiosity overcoming decorum. Miss Marple, slower but no less alert, brought up the rear. There, lying motionless by the lich gate, was Arthur Symes. His choir book open beside him, pages fluttering in the breeze. His expression was oddly serene, but the ugly bruise at his temple and the dark stain spreading beneath his head told another story entirely. For a moment, no one spoke. The birds had gone quiet. Then Mrs. Price Ridley gasped. "Murder," she whispered. And though the word seemed almost blasphemous in that bright churchyard, everyone knew it was true. Miss Marple, still clutching her knitting bag, looked down at the scene and sighed very softly. "Oh dear," she murmured, "how very like human nature." There are few things so efficient as village alarm. It travels on feet quicker than any motor car and arrives dressed in certainty. By the time Reverend Clement had sent a boy to the telephone kiosk for the police and asked gently for everyone to return to the nave, the news had already leapt the hedge into the vicarage, crossed the lane to the grocer's, and was sliding sotto voce between the teacups in Mrs. Bantry's sitting room. People who had not thought of Arthur Symes for weeks found themselves recalling his punctual gait, his brown felt hat, and the habit he had of tapping letters into place before closing the post-bag. The most ordinary details acquire significance when a life has been stopped. Miss Marple did not hurry. She looked steadily at the lich gate, its timbers weathered to the color of old bread, and at the choir book fallen like a startled bird. A sprig of nettle near Mr. Symes's hand was crushed at an angle she thought not quite compatible with a simple fall. She did not touch it. There is a virtue, she had learned long ago, in letting things lie a moment before the world arranges them to suit itself. When Dr. Haydock arrived, brisk and sensible, he glanced at Miss Marple's stillness and then knelt by the body, his mouth tightening in a way that made even Mrs. Price Ridley postpone pronouncement. "Blow to the head," he said finally, voice subdued. "Not the sort a man gives himself. Time, likely within the hour. There's no pulse. Poor fellow." "Robbery." Colonel Melchett, summoned in his capacity as chief constable rather than reluctant chorister, had a soldier's economy of speech. "No," Dr. Haydock replied, lifting the lapel of Symes's jacket with a careful forefinger. "Pocketbook present. Watch present. Whoever did it was not after small coin." Gently, the men bore Mr. Symes away, and the living, finding themselves suddenly superfluous, returned to the nave where the air still held the organ's breath. People do not like to be left with their thoughts. They prefer them echoed by others. "It will be some outsider," Mrs. Price Ridley declared, locating the comfort of distance. "They wander through villages nowadays, all manner of persons. The government encourages it." Arthur had no enemies, Reverend Clement murmured, which in a village meant only that his enemies had been quiet. Gladys Weatherby twisted her gloves into a rope. She had never seen death before, except in her grandfather, and he had not been startling, only absent. She kept recalling that Mr. Symes had nodded to her on Friday in the post office, and how kind his nod had been when she stumbled over the stamped denominations. A kindness felt personal, and its violation worse. Mr. Tupper cleared his throat with authority, as if a strong baritone might set the world right again. "We must remember our duties. The Easter anthem cannot be abandoned merely because of an incident. The congregation will expect—" No one responded. His words hung, heavy and inappropriate, until Miss Hartnell said too loudly, "He was late, you know. Mr. Symes. He is never late. Something must have detained him before he reached us." "After all," murmured Miss Marple from her seat at the back, "one seldom trips over nothing." She did not mean the path. She meant habits. There was a small shifting of eyes in her direction, curiosity tinted with a degree of relief. If Miss Marple observed, it was somehow less terrible. Her observations were like a neat cold compress on a fever, soothing precisely because they did not attempt to be dramatic. She was, to most, a sweet old lady with a faculty for knitting and remembering people's birthdays. They undervalued the birthdays. People do very telling things on their birthdays. The police from Much Benham arrived and performed the necessary inquiries with an air of doing honor to a checklist. They asked when the choir had assembled. 10 past. Whether anyone had seen Mr. Symes that morning. Mrs. Bartlett had seen him at 8, buying a rasher of bacon. Whether he had enemies. No, how absurd. Whether anyone had left the rehearsal for any length of time. Gladys to fetch her music. Miss Hartnell, briefly, to scold the verger about dust, and Mr. Tupper to ensure the vestry door had not been left ajar. They wrote down the answers as if writing them made the world stable. The world, however, had shifted by a degree that paper cannot catch. When they had gone, people found reasons to linger in little clumps. The memory of the bruise brought a feverish brightness to the eyes. Motives were considered and discarded as swiftly as they were invented. Mrs. Price Ridley believed the new road had brought criminal elements. Miss Hartnell thought Mr. Symes must have been in the way of someone's romance. These young people. Mr. Tupper, alternating between indignation and something like personal affront, insisted that our baritone's voice was too valuable to be threatened, which told Miss Marple more about Mr. Tupper than about the crime. Reverend Clement approached Miss Marple with the earnestness of a man who would never presume but very much hoped to be presumed upon. "Miss Marple," he began quietly, "forgive me if this is an imposition, but if anything strikes you as odd—" "Oh, but nearly everything is odd if one looks at it squarely," she said pleasantly. "It is the habit of life to tilt itself so people won't notice. Though I did think, if you don't mind, that Mr. Symes's choir book had fallen a trifle too neatly. They often do. Of course. Fall neatly, I mean, if one is carrying a book for which one has respect. But the pages were turned back to last year's harvest hymn. You remember the one with the rather difficult descant? That interested me. How extraordinary, the vicar murmured, half because it was, and half because he wished to be the sort of person to whom extraordinary remarks were naturally addressed. Not at all, Miss Marple said. People form habits in the mind just as they do with their feet on the path to the post office. The mind, when startled, will sometimes grasp at its last comfortable place. I dare say Mr. Symes particularly liked that hymn. It might show he was startled rather than struck from behind without warning. Though, of course, one mustn't insist. Startled by whom? Asked Gladys, who had drifted near, the rope of gloves now a chain. She flushed when both turned to her. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, only he helped me on Friday, and I feel I ought. It is always commendable to feel one ought, Miss Marple said kindly. Did you notice anything at rehearsal? Anything different? Gladys thought, brow puckered. Only that Mrs. Bartlett said the morning letters were muddled. She told me so when I stopped for a peppermint. She said Mr. Symes had been flustered, but I thought that odd because he never is. Oh, and the vestry key, Mr. Tupper had it earlier than usual. He said there was a draught and he couldn't abide it. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the vicar's quiet study that afternoon, where she had allowed herself to be shepherded for tea. Outside, the village buzzed. Inside, time settled again like dust. A muddled post, a flustered man, a key earlier than usual, and a book that had opened itself to comfort. None of these were proof. They were the small, stubborn consistencies by which people lived, and by which sometimes they died. It is like Mrs. Green's canary, she said after a while, more to herself than to the vicar, who nevertheless straightened instinctively. It stopped singing last Michaelmas because the cage had been moved 3 inches. People are not unlike canaries about their cages. The bell rang. Colonel Melchett stood at the door, hat in hand, jaw set. "We've found something," he said without preamble. By the boundary path, a walking stick, heavy head, blood on it. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, not because it was dear, but because that small, old-fashioned exclamation left room for more information to arrive. "Whose?" "That," said the colonel grimly, "appears to be the oddest part. It's marked on the silver band, E.T. Mr. Tupper's initials seemed to thud in the room like an unwelcome drumbeat. The vicar's eyes darted to Miss Marple's face, looking for alarm. He found only that polite, almost apologetic interest with which she had watched caterpillars ruin a rosebud. "How inconvenient for the anthem," she said, softly. "And, I fear, for Mr. Tupper." Colonel Melchett stood with the stick balanced across his palms, the silver band glinting faintly in the lamplight. It was a fine piece, too fine for the practicalities of walking, with a heavy carved head in the shape of a lion's paw. The initials were indeed plain, E.T., engraved with the sort of pride that comes from a Christmas gift or a retirement token. Dr. Haydock, summoned again to the vicarage, confirmed the obvious. The stain is blood, fresh enough. The weight and shape would fit the wound's nature. If it isn't the weapon, it's a twin. He spoke crisply, but Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes flicked toward Melchett, uneasy at what this might imply. Melchett frowned, turning the stick over once more. "Tupper swears by a stick like this. Carries it everywhere, even to rehearsal. Blast it, I've seen him leaning on the thing like a staff of office. But no man in his right mind leaves a murder weapon lying about." "Unless," Miss Marple said gently, "he did not realize he had." Both men looked at her. It was the sort of remark she made often, soft and ambiguous, leaving people to decide whether it meant something or nothing at all. Melchett sighed. "I'll have to bring Tupper in for questioning, at least formally. Appearances demand it. He's been choir master here for 20 years, but that doesn't grant immunity. The questioning took place that same evening in the vestry. The walls smelled of hymnals and beeswax polish. The great wooden cross above the door seemed to listen, impassive. Mr. Tupper arrived flushed and perspiring, his collar slightly wilted. His manner alternated between outrage and tremulous self-justification. "I cannot think," he declared, his voice booming against the rafters, "how my walking stick came to be anywhere near that poor man. Yes, it's mine. I won't deny it. I missed it after rehearsal, assumed I'd left it in the porch. But murder? Dear me, no. I've never lifted a hand to anyone in my life." Melchit's gaze was level. "You left the church during rehearsal, Mr. Tupper, to check the vestry door, you said." "Indeed. A draught, ghastly thing for the throat. I can't conduct a choir with my tonsils in revolt." "And during that time, did you see Mr. Symes?" "No. If I had, I'd have told you at once. He must have come by later, poor soul, though why he'd be loitering outside the churchyard." He trailed off, twisting his hat in his hands. "Surely you don't think—" "I think," Melchett interrupted, "that your stick is the best lead we've got." Miss Marple, seated discreetly near the door, watched the play of emotions across Mr. Tupper's face. Indignation, fear, then the swift calculation of a man adjusting his story to the room's temperature. She'd seen it many times. At the Women's Institute, when a member had accidentally taken another's prize jam jar, and once during the war, when a maid's guilty conscience betrayed a packet of sugar hoarded from rations. People's expressions, she knew, changed before their words did. "Of course," she said mildly. "It's quite possible someone borrowed your stick, Mr. Tupper. I remember my nephew Raymond doing that once. Took his landlord's umbrella without a thought, and then the poor man went halfway to Paddington in the rain before realizing it was gone. A very natural sort of confusion." Tupper seized on her suggestion. Yes, precisely. Someone might have taken it by mistake. There were a dozen people in the church, coming and going. I left it by the organ bench for a moment, and when I came back it was gone. I said as much to Miss Hartnell, didn't I? She'll remember." Whether Miss Hartnell remembered or not, no one could verify it that night. She was at home with what she described as a faintness of the nerves, but the following morning, the village's gossip wheel turned anew, grinding facts and suppositions into fine flour. "Of course he did it," Mrs. Price Ridley announced at the grocer's, her tone heavy with moral satisfaction. "All that authority, conducting people, telling them when to stand and when to sit, goes to a man's head. Power corrupts." Mrs. Bartlett, behind the counter, disagreed. "Mr. Tupper's a fuss-pot, that's all, but not violent. He once fainted when I killed a chicken behind the shop." Gladys Weatherby, arriving for her morning tea, listened silently. She had hardly slept. The image of Mr. Symes's still face haunted her dreams. She had felt somehow responsible, though she could not have said why. That morning she had walked to the post office before it opened, half hoping to see his familiar shape behind the counter. The door was locked, of course. A single letter had been slipped under it, an envelope with no stamp, addressed in an elegant feminine hand. She mentioned it to Miss Marple when the latter appeared at the tea shop later that day, ordering a modest slice of seed cake. "It was on the floor just inside the door," Gladys said, lowering her voice. "White paper, thick like the sort used for invitations. I don't suppose it matters, but it looked out of place." "Perhaps it does matter," Miss Marple replied. "Out-of-place things often do. I wonder, was there a scent?" Gladys blinked. "A scent? Yes, my dear. Letters can carry a person's presence far better than ink alone. Lavender water, perhaps? Or violet?" Gladys thought hard. "I think, yes, violet, faintly." Miss Marple smiled. "That would be Mrs. Price Ridley's perfume. She has used it since before the war, one of those loyalties women form to compensate for the unreliability of men." Gladys was too startled to reply, but Miss Marple only sipped her tea with a mild air of abstraction. Later, she took a quiet walk past the post office herself. The constable guarding the door nodded respectfully. She was, after all, Miss Marple, and her curiosity had never yet caused trouble. She glanced through the window, neat rows of envelopes, a few parcels, and on the counter, a small brass seal. When Colonel Melchett called again that evening to report that Tupper was being held pending further inquiry, Miss Marple listened without interruption. He seemed tired. Murder in a small village always felt personal, like a stain on the parish silver. "Evidence is thin," he admitted. "But that stick, it's damning. And apparently, he argued with Symes last week about choir funds. Some nonsense over unpaid dues. Motive enough for a hot temper." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but not for murder, not for Mr. Tupper. He's vain, not violent. It would take more than choir funds to make him raise a hand. I wonder what really vexed Mr. Symes that morning. He was flustered, you recall, and the post was muddled. People don't muddle the post unless something has quite disordered them." Melchett frowned. "You think he found something? Or someone found him?" she murmured. "If we knew what that unstamped letter contained, we might know why the choir lost its baritone." He gave a short laugh. "You're too shrewd by half, Miss Marple." "Not shrewd," she corrected gently, gathering her knitting. "Just old enough to have seen most things happen once, and foolish enough to notice when they begin happening again." As the vicarage clock struck 9, she looked toward the church tower, dark against the fading sky. Somewhere between the hymns and the gossip, a truth lay waiting, as quiet and certain as evening settling over St. Mary Mead. Morning came to St. Mary Mead with the deceptive calm of spring, the mist curling low over the thatched roofs as though it meant to muffle the villagers' gossip before it reached full volume. But nothing, not even fog, could contain the chatter now. By breakfast, every household knew that Mr. Tupper was being kept for questioning, and that Miss Marple had been seen walking by the post office twice the previous evening, an observation which, though entirely true, had far less sinister purpose than the whispers implied. Miss Marple, at that hour, sat in her little parlour, a pot of tea steaming beside her and a neat row of envelopes before her. Letters she meant to answer, though her eyes kept wandering to the garden outside, where the first crocuses trembled in the breeze. Her needles lay idle. Instead, she held a small sheet of paper folded into quarters, which she had found tucked inside the morning's newspaper. It was unsigned and written in an uneven hand. "They've got the wrong man, but the truth won't stay quiet." No address, no name, only the faint smudge of a thumbprint where the fold had been pressed. It could have been the prank of a bored boy, but Miss Marple's instincts told her otherwise. The phrasing had that curious mixture of fear and defiance she'd often noticed when guilt brushed close to innocence. She placed the note beside her teacup and rose, fastening her shawl with a silver brooch. It was not curiosity that moved her to visit the vicarage again that morning. It was the sense that time, once it began to unravel, rarely stopped of its own accord. Reverend Clement greeted her in his study, looking both grateful and harassed. "You've heard, of course," he began, pouring tea that sloshed over the saucer. "About the note left for Colonel Melchett, anonymous, same as yours, I suspect. It was found under the church door early this morning. Said much the same thing. An innocent man sits while the guilty ones sing still. The police are taking it seriously, though heaven knows it could be mischief." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Anonymous letters are rarely mischief, dear Reverend. They're a coward's confession, either of guilt or of knowledge too dangerous to claim." He looked pained. But who in St. Mary Mead would write such things? She smiled faintly. Almost anyone, if they believed it would ease their conscience or protect their reputation. Human nature is infinitely inventive where self-preservation is concerned. That afternoon, the police expanded their search of the churchyard and surrounding hedgerows. Villagers lingered at their gates under the pretext of tending roses, though it was February and nothing much was growing. By tea-time, the constable had unearthed 2 new items: a torn scrap of music sheet, handwritten, the sort used by choir members for personal notes, and a lady's handkerchief embroidered with the initial G. "Gladys Weatherby," said Mrs. Price Ridley with triumphant certainty when the discovery was announced. "I knew it. That girl's far too quiet, and quiet people are dangerous. You mark my words." Miss Marple, who happened to be within earshot at the grocer's, made a soft, contemplative sound. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Price Ridley, quietness is often only the good manners of people who have had little encouragement to speak." Still, when she returned home, she found herself thinking of Gladys. The nervous eyes, the twisting gloves, the mention of the unstamped letter with its scent of violets. A handkerchief with G could be coincidence, of course, but coincidences in human affairs were much rarer than people believed. That evening, Miss Marple invited Gladys for tea under the gentle pretext of keeping company on a dreary night. The young woman arrived pale and subdued, her eyes darting to every shadow as if expecting accusation to leap from it. "My dear," Miss Marple began kindly, once she'd poured the tea, "these are difficult times for everyone. You mustn't let gossip trouble you. People speak sharply when they're frightened." "I haven't done anything," Gladys said at once, the words spilling out like confession. "I only found that letter, and now everyone looks at me as if I'd killed him myself." Miss Marple's tone remained mild. "Tell me, my dear, you said you saw the envelope inside the post office, unstamped and with Mrs. Price Ridley's scent upon it. Did you by any chance notice whether it was sealed?" Gladys frowned. "Sealed? No. No, it wasn't. That's right. It was folded but not licked shut. The flap was tucked in." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And you're quite sure it was addressed to Mr. Symes?" "Yes. His name was written plainly. Mr. Arthur Symes, Post Office, St. Mary Mead." "I thought it odd, since that's where he worked, but perhaps she meant it as something personal." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, though her eyes had grown distant. She knew Mrs. Price Ridley's handwriting, large, imperious, and incapable of ambiguity. But the vicar had said the letter found under the church door was written in an uneven hand. Uneven hands belonged not to commanding women, but to trembling ones. When Gladys had gone, Miss Marple took out the folded note from her morning paper once more. The slant of the letters, the uncertain pressure of the pen. It was the same as the vicar had described. Someone was frightened enough to write twice, but not brave enough to sign their name. At 9 o'clock, she slipped into her coat and stepped out into the evening air. The mist had thinned to a soft veil, and the church tower loomed faintly silver in the moonlight. She crossed the graveyard path where Mr. Symes had been found, her steps measured and sure. Near the lich gate, she paused, bending to examine the ground where the grass had not yet recovered. A few dried leaves stirred, and beneath them, something pale caught her eye. A corner of paper, half buried in the soil. She drew it out carefully. It was another scrap of music paper, written in Mr. Tupper's bold, slanting hand. A baritone line, annotated, "Repeat from second verse. Do not forget the change." But the ink beneath it was blurred, as if a wet thumb had smeared it, and just visible in the margin, pressed faintly into the pulp, was the shape of a postage seal. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her breath clouding in the cool air. Someone had handled this paper and a letter at the same time. Someone who knew both music and mail. By morning, Colonel Melchett was astonished to find Miss Marple waiting at his door. She stood very calmly, her gloves folded neatly in one hand. "I think, Colonel," she said, "you may wish to speak again with the young lady from the post office. Not Gladys Weatherby, but the one who helps there part-time. Mrs. Bartlett's niece, I believe. She delivers the overflow letters on market days. She also sings alto." Melchett frowned. You mean Clara Jennings? What on earth for? Because, said Miss Marple, her voice mild as ever, I believe she knows exactly why Mr. Symes's choir book opened to the harvest hymn. It wasn't chance, you see. It was memory. And memory, Colonel, can be a very dangerous thing when one means to forget. She left him staring after her, her figure small but unyielding against the pale morning light as the village clock struck 8, the hour when the post would soon be sorted again, and where, among the envelopes, the truth had waited patiently all along. Colonel Melchett did not relish being directed, even gently, by Miss Marple, but he had long since learned the futility of arguing with her. Her logic arrived quietly, wrapped in the soft tones of tea-time conversation, but beneath it ran a vein of steel. That morning, he sent for Clara Jennings. The young woman appeared at the police station, pale and composed, her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles shone white. I'm told you assist occasionally at the post office, Melchett began, voice deliberately casual. Help sort the letters when Mr. Symes was overburdened. Yes, sir. Tuesdays and Fridays, when the market post comes in heavy. You were there the morning of his death? Yes, she hesitated. Only for a little while. I left just before 9. He said he could manage the rest. Miss Marple, seated in the corner with the air of someone waiting for a bus that would eventually arrive, glanced up. Such a helpful arrangement, she murmured. And so considerate of you to assist him. Mr. Symes was always particular about his post, wasn't he? I remember once he sent back a letter that had been sealed with green wax instead of red. It troubled him dreadfully. Clara gave a faint, uncertain smile. He liked things tidy. He said a letter should look as proper as a person's conscience. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. And yet, conscience can be so difficult to keep in order, don't you think? It requires constant tending. The girl's eyes flickered, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. Melchett leaned forward. Mrs. Bartlett's niece, aren't you? Live just off Church Lane? You sing in the choir, too? Yes, Colonel. Alto. Mr. Tupper's section? Yes. Melchett's tone hardened almost imperceptibly. Then perhaps you can explain why his walking stick was found near the scene. Clara's composure cracked slightly. I can't, sir. I only know I saw it in the vestry before rehearsal. He'd leaned it against the wall, same as always. And did anyone else go near it? I don't remember. Miss Hartnell might have. Or Mrs. Bartlett when she brought in the flowers. Miss Marple spoke again, so quietly that Clara turned toward her as though drawn by gentleness alone. You were fond of Mr. Symes, perhaps? Color rose sharply to the young woman's cheeks. Everyone liked him. Oh, yes, Miss Marple agreed, but not everyone is remembered in the same way. I fancy Mr. Symes was a man who made kindness feel very personal, which can be confusing to a young woman with a romantic heart. A tear welled, sudden and unbidden. Clara dabbed at it angrily. He was kind, that's all, and he wasn't happy lately. Something had been troubling him, I think. I think someone was blackmailing him. Melchett sat upright. Blackmailing? Yes. The words came in a rush now, tripping over one another. I didn't mean to pry, but once, when I was helping sort the mail, I saw a letter. Plain envelope, no stamp, slipped among the rest. He went very white when he saw it, and told me sharply to mind my own business. After that, he started locking the drawer with the parish records in it. He looked frightened, as if someone knew something about him he couldn't bear to have told. Miss Marple's knitting had resumed its quiet rhythm. And you thought perhaps you could help him? Clara nodded miserably. I tried. I asked once if he was in trouble, but he just said some things in life were mistakes one couldn't mend. The next week he was dead. Melchett's pen scratched furiously across his notebook. Do you have any idea who might have sent the letter? I'm not certain, but I did see Mrs. Price Ridley at the post office that morning, just before it arrived. She was waiting outside, pretending to count her change, and she She smelled of violets. Miss Marple looked up briefly, her eyes bright. "How very observant of you, my dear. But do you know, I don't think Mrs. Price Ridley would bother to write anything anonymously. Her courage, like her perfume, is rather old-fashioned, floral, but strong. No, if she had a grievance, she would sign it boldly." Melchett frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple sighed. "Perhaps someone who feared exposure as much as she sought to prevent it. We must consider what Mr. Symes might have known. If he was being blackmailed, then the secret must belong not only to him, but to another. Blackmail is a two-handed sin. It requires knowledge and silence." Clara was dismissed soon after, pale but relieved to have spoken. When she had gone, Melchett turned to Miss Marple. "You think she's telling the truth?" "I do," Miss Marple said, "but not all of it consciously. There's something she hasn't yet understood about her own part in this business. Innocent omissions can be more revealing than lies." That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village, stopping as always to exchange pleasantries. At the greengrocer's, she heard Mrs. Bartlett lamenting that young Clara's nerves are all frayed, and that Arthur Symes's death will be the end of our choir entirely. At the baker's, the talk was of the walking stick and whether Colonel Melchett would charge Mr. Tupper, and at the church she found Reverend Clement pacing the nave in dismay, holding a sheaf of music. "They've cancelled choir practice," he said helplessly. "Mr. Tupper's under suspicion, half the altos are ill, and poor Gladys won't come near the place." Miss Marple looked over the music sheets. Among them was one marked faintly in pencil. "Hymn 312, repeat from second verse." The same annotation she had found in the graveyard. She traced the faint smudge with her finger. "You wouldn't happen to know whose handwriting this is, would you?" The vicar peered. "Tupper's, surely." "I thought so too. And yet, the pressure's wrong. He writes with authority, you see, confident strokes. This hand trembles." "Then whose?" "Someone imitating him, which means someone wanted the blame to fall squarely on Mr. Tupper. Quite clever, really, but the cleverness gives them away." She slipped the sheet into her handbag and turned toward the church door. Outside, dusk was beginning to descend, and the air smelled faintly of violets. Somewhere a bell tolled, soft and mournful. As she reached the gate, she met Dr. Haydock on his rounds. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I was coming to see you. Thought you should know. The blow that killed Symes came from the left. The assailant must be left-handed. That narrows your field a bit." "Does it indeed?" she said, smiling faintly. "How very fortunate. It so happens Mr. Tupper is right-handed, and as I recall, Clara Jennings, poor child, is too. But Mrs. Bartlett, she carries her basket in her right arm to free her left. Habit of years." Dr. Haydock looked startled. "You think Mrs. Bartlett—" "Oh, I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that we must never underestimate women who keep shops. They hear everything and forget nothing." She turned away, her step unhurried, her expression thoughtful. The scent of violets lingered faintly in the breeze, and somewhere behind her, the church door creaked shut with the sound of something coming very near its end. The following morning dawned with a brittle clarity, as though the village had been scrubbed clean overnight. The frost on the hedges sparkled under the thin sunlight, and even the church bell, when it tolled 8, sounded sharper than usual. Miss Marple sat by her kitchen window, her hands folded over her lap, and watched the first of the villagers making their way along the lane. Gladys Weatherby hurrying to the schoolhouse, Mrs. Bartlett sweeping her doorstep with quick, brisk strokes, and Dr. Haydock cycling past on his rounds. It was all quite ordinary again, outwardly. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that evil preferred to hide behind routine. She thought over the doctor's remark from the previous evening. The killer had struck from the left. A small fact, easily overlooked, yet facts like that often tip the whole scale of truth. Mr. Tupper, poor man, was right-handed. So were Clara Jennings and Gladys Weatherby, But Mrs. Bartlett, with her habitual left arm free, fitted that single detail too neatly to ignore. Yet Miss Marple's mind, precise as a clock, refused to stop there. Motive was the missing cog. People might kill for love, jealousy, money, or fear. Which had moved Mrs. Bartlett, or had she merely handled what she should not have? By mid-morning, Colonel Melchett had come calling again, stamping snow from his boots and looking deeply dissatisfied. "You were right about the handwriting." "Blast it," he began without preamble. "That music sheet, it's not Tupper's. Forensics confirmed it. Someone forged his hand well enough to fool a casual glance. Whoever did it meant to frame him." He dropped into Miss Marple's armchair with a sigh. "We've released him, though he's in such a state he may never conduct again, but that still leaves us nowhere nearer to finding who did strike Symes down." "Oh, I wouldn't say nowhere, Colonel," Miss Marple said mildly, setting his teacup on its saucer. "Sometimes one must go backward to move forward. You recall that muddled post, letters misplaced as if his thoughts had been elsewhere. I wonder what sort of letter could fluster a man so steady." Melchett frowned. "We found no letter on him, just the choir book in his watch." "Precisely," she murmured. "Then it was taken." The colonel looked sharply at her. "You believe someone removed it from the scene?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that whoever killed him wanted that letter more than they feared discovery. And I suspect it was written not to Mr. Symes, but by him." Her words hung in the air for a long moment, the fire crackling softly. Melchett leaned forward. "A confession?" "Of sorts. A confession, or a warning. Perhaps he knew too much about another's secret and meant to speak before it was too late. Blackmailers, you see, are not the only ones who use the post to settle accounts." At that, Melchett's expression shifted. Part suspicion, part reluctant admiration. "You're thinking of Bartlett." "I'm thinking of anyone with access to both the post and the choir," she said carefully. "Mrs. Bartlett keeps the accounts for the parish events, doesn't she? She would have reason to be near both letters and people's private affairs. And her niece, poor Clara, said he locked the parish records after receiving an unstamped note. Perhaps something among those records frightened him." Melchett stood. "We'll search the post office again." By noon, the little building was turned inside out. Every drawer, ledger, and cubbyhole was examined under Mrs. Bartlett's indignant supervision. She protested loudly, her round face flushed with outrage. "I'll not have my good name dragged through mud because of a man who couldn't mind his own business. Arthur Symes was a fool and brought this trouble on himself." Miss Marple, standing near the counter, said nothing. Her eyes rested on the row of pigeonholes behind the desk, each marked with names in tidy script. She noticed that one of them, labeled Parish Correspondence, had a faint smear across its wood, a smudge the color of dried ink. And just above it, tucked half behind the slot, was a folded scrap of paper. "Dear me," she said softly. "How untidy. Perhaps this was overlooked." She drew it out before Mrs. Bartlett could object. The note was brief, written in a bold hand unmistakably belonging to Arthur Symes. "You may think it's forgotten, but truth does not stay buried. Meet me after practice, behind the church." The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Bartlett's protest died on her lips. Colonel Melchett read it twice, his jaw tightening. "Well, that settles motive enough for me. What was he threatening you with, Mrs. Bartlett?" Her denial came sharp and immediate. "Nothing. It wasn't about me. It was about my husband. Rest his soul. He managed the parish funds years ago, before poor Arthur took over. There were discrepancies, I won't deny that, but we made it right. Arthur promised never to mention it. He gave his word." "And you feared he'd broken it?" She turned on Miss Marple then, her voice trembling. "You think I killed him? I swear before God I didn't. Yes, I met him that morning. I went to beg him not to go to the vicar. He was angry. Said someone had been tampering with the old records, hiding evidence. I don't know who. He stormed out before I could stop him." Miss Marple's expression was gentle, but her eyes missed nothing. "And you followed him?" "I did. Only to reason with him. But when I reached the gate, he was already lying there. I thought someone would blame me, so I ran." Her confession left even Melchett momentarily speechless. Mrs. Bartlett sank onto the stool behind the counter, her hands trembling. "I should have told you, but who would believe me? The letter, the quarrel, everything points to me. I didn't touch him, I swear it." Miss Marple moved closer. "Then who was there when you arrived?" "No one," she whispered. "At least, no one I saw. But I heard something. A hymn, just a line, hummed softly. 'Praise my soul, the King of Heaven.'" Miss Marple's heart gave a small, perceptible jolt. "That was Mr. Tupper's favorite, was it not?" "Yes," Mrs. Bartlett said, looking up. "But it wasn't his voice. It was higher, a woman's voice." When Melchett left to make further inquiries, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, her thoughts racing in quiet, measured rhythm. A woman's voice, a left-handed blow, a letter promising exposure. She thanked Mrs. Bartlett kindly, promised discretion, and walked out into the cold afternoon. As she turned the corner toward the churchyard, she caught sight of Gladys Weatherby standing by the fence, her eyes fixed on the ground where the frost had not yet melted. The girl looked small and lost, her gloved hands clenched before her. Miss Marple watched her for a long moment before approaching. "It's hard to come here, isn't it?" she said gently. "Death is always unpleasant when one feels connected to it." Gladys started, color rising in her cheeks. "I shouldn't have come. I just wanted to see it once more." "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said. "Grief often draws us back to the place where our hearts stumbled." Gladys's lip trembled. "He was good to me. He understood things I never said, and now everyone looks at me as if I— Oh, Miss Marple, you don't think I did, do you?" Miss Marple took her hand. "No, my dear, but I think perhaps you know who did. You just haven't allowed yourself to see it yet." The girl's eyes widened, and for a moment something flickered there. Fear, recognition, and guilt tangled together. Then she turned away, staring toward the silent church. From somewhere far off, faint but unmistakable, came the echo of that same hymn. Soft, wistful, a woman's voice singing under her breath. Miss Marple's gaze followed the sound, narrowing slightly. She knew now where the final thread led, and she meant to tug it, very gently, until the whole tapestry gave way. Gladys Weatherby stood very still by the lych gate, her gloved hands gripping the iron railing as if she could hold the world in place. Miss Marple's words lingered in the air between them, soft but heavy, the kind of truth that could not yet be born. The girl's lips parted as though to speak, then pressed shut again. There was fear in her eyes. Fear and something darker beneath it, like guilt softened by confusion. Miss Marple did not press her. She merely gave a faint nod, as if the silence itself had confirmed something. The next morning, Colonel Melchett called at Miss Marple's cottage, his face set in that resigned expression reserved for unpleasant business. "We've checked Bartlett's story," he said, refusing the offered scone with a grim shake of the head. "She told the truth about seeing Symes. But there's one detail she left out. Someone saw her niece Clara leaving the churchyard shortly before the body was found. Claims she was crying, and she's vanished since dawn." Miss Marple sighed softly, setting her knitting aside. "Vanished, or merely gone somewhere she hoped not to be found?" Melchett frowned. "You think she's hiding?" "People seldom disappear without a reason, Colonel. Guilt and terror can drive one to folly, even if one's conscience is clear. But there's something else. Did you find the letter Symes wrote?" He shook his head. "No trace of it." "Then it's still here, somewhere in St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple murmured. "And perhaps Clara knows where." The colonel rubbed his temples. If she's hiding, she won't stay hidden long. We'll have the constable question the trains and inns, though I'd give a good deal to know what devil's game Symes was playing with all these letters. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, yes, letters. The modern substitute for confession. So much easier to write than to say, aloud. That afternoon brought the first snow in weeks, small flakes that drifted like ash over the churchyard. The village kept to their firesides, but Miss Marple wrapped her shawl and walked through the quiet streets to Mrs. Bartlett's shop. She found the woman pale and tremulous, rearranging tins on the shelf with nervous energy. "You've heard about your niece, of course," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Bartlett's hands stilled. "She'll come home when she's ready. She's a good girl, just frightened. She has reason to be, I dare say. Secrets weigh more heavily on the young. Did she ever mention anything Mr. Symes said to her that morning?" Mrs. Bartlett hesitated, then shook her head too quickly. "Nothing important, only that he was troubled. I told her not to get involved." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "But involvement doesn't always wait for permission. It arrives quietly, through a kind word perhaps, or a misplaced trust." She picked up a tin of treacle thoughtfully. "Do you happen to recall what became of the parish record books? I believe Mr. Symes kept them here. Did he not?" The woman looked startled. "Here? No, he took them himself last week. Said he was checking the old ledgers against the choir accounts." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "How thorough of him. I wonder where they are now." She left the shop soon after, her thoughts moving with their own rhythm. The ledgers, Mrs. Bartlett's husband's discrepancies, the blackmail letter, the unstamped note, all threads weaving toward one hand. But whose? The wrongs of the past often tangled the present, and Miss Marple had seen enough of human frailty to know that guilt could skip a generation as easily as a stone on water. By evening, the constable returned with word that Clara had been found at the disused railway halt just outside the village. She was cold, shivering, and near hysterical, insisting she had nothing to do with the murder. Miss Marple persuaded Melchett to let her speak to the girl before any formal questioning. Clara sat in the vicarage kitchen, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes red and swollen. Miss Marple took the chair opposite, her manner as gentle as ever. "My dear, no one wishes to harm you, but running away never saves the innocent. It only convinces the guilty they've succeeded. Tell me what happened." "I didn't kill him," Clara whispered. "I swear I didn't. I only wanted to stop it." "Stop what, child?" "The letters," she said. "He was going to send one. To the bishop, I think. About money taken from the parish fund years ago. My aunt begged him not to. She said it would ruin her. But he said the truth had to be told. Then, that morning, I saw Mrs. Bartlett leave the post office in tears. Mr. Symes looked different, harder. He told me he was meeting someone behind the church. He said afterward it would all be over. I followed him." Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "You saw who met him?" Clara's voice dropped. "Gladys. She came out from the path near the birches. She had something in her hand, a letter. She gave it to him and said he had no right. Then he grabbed her arm. I heard her cry out, and she struck him. Not hard, just to free herself. But he fell. Oh, Miss Marple, he fell against the stone." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind against the window. "And then?" "She ran. I went to him, but there was blood. I tried to lift him, but he didn't move. I panicked. I took the letter and ran." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "I was too afraid to show anyone." Miss Marple unfolded the paper carefully. The ink had run slightly, but the words were clear. "To whom it may concern, Mrs. Bartlett's husband was not the only one. The funds were mishandled again. The records will prove it. Gladys Weatherby was to assist me." Miss Marple's mouth tightened faintly. So that was the secret. Poor Arthur, too rigid for deceit, too naive for discretion. When Melchett returned, She handed him the letter. "Gladys didn't mean to kill him," she said simply. "It was an accident. Fear, anger, a moment's impulse. But she concealed it, and in doing so nearly destroyed 2 other lives." The colonel read the letter slowly, his expression darkening. "The girl must confess herself. We'll handle it quietly. You've done it again, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "I've done nothing, Colonel. Only noticed how the smallest details, the way a book falls, the direction of a blow, a scent of violets, reveal what people wish most to hide." Outside, the snow had stopped. The village lay still as if holding its breath. Later, when Miss Marple walked home beneath the pale moonlight, she paused by the lich gate where the choir's baritone had fallen. The ground was smooth again, the frost clean. She stood for a moment, her eyes soft with pity. "It is always the same," she murmured to herself. "So much trouble comes from the kindest intentions, and from hearts that cannot bear the weight of honesty." Then, drawing her shawl closer, she went on toward her cottage, the faint echo of a hymn following her through the quiet night. The following day brought with it a thin, reluctant sun, melting the snow from the church roof in steady drips. It was Sunday again, 1 week since the choir's ill-fated rehearsal, and though St. Mary Mead wore its usual calm, something trembled beneath the surface, a tension that no hymn could soothe. Word had spread quietly that Gladys Weatherby was in custody for her own protection, though the village preferred to call it resting. The police had chosen discretion, but secrets had a way of seeping through the thatch and ivy of country life. Miss Marple walked to the church as she always did, unhurried, her step as steady as her thoughts. The villagers nodded to her, with that mixture of respect and fear reserved for those who seemed to know too much. She took her usual seat near the back pew, the place from which she saw best without being noticed. The choir stalls were half empty, and the absence of Mr. Symes hung heavier than any sermon. Mr. Tupper, restored but subdued, led the hymns in a tone of subdued dignity, his stick now replaced by a modest cane. When the service ended, the congregation dispersed in clusters, their whispers mingling with the rustle of winter coats. Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, her gaze tracing the lines of the path where everything had begun. It was curious, she thought, how human nature clung to place, the mind returning to its own crime scene as faithfully as a compass to north. Colonel Melchett joined her, his breath clouding in the cold air. "We've taken Gladys's statement," he said, low enough that the nearby parishioners wouldn't hear. "She admitted she struck Symes, but insists it was an accident. There's no reason to doubt it. The coroner will rule it manslaughter, I expect. Pity for the girl, but the truth's clear enough." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple quietly, "but truth can be rather like the surface of ice. One thinks it's solid until one steps upon it." Melchett frowned. "You think there's more?" "I think," she said slowly, "that poor Gladys's story fits too neatly. Real guilt is seldom tidy, and accidents, when genuine, do not end with letters burned and hands trembling for days after." He studied her face. "You believe she's protecting someone?" "Not protecting precisely. Shielding. There's a difference. Protection is active. Shielding is desperate." They walked together toward the lich gate. Miss Marple paused beside the birches, their pale bark gleaming faintly. "Tell me, Colonel, what became of that letter Clara found?" "It's in our custody, of course." "Ah, but did you notice," she said softly, "that the signature was missing? Mr. Symes signed every letter, even to the grocer. He was punctilious about propriety. I cannot imagine he would omit his name unless he never meant the letter to be sent." Melchett looked puzzled. "But it was in his handwriting." "Oh, yes. But writing is an easy thing to imitate when one has watched it often enough. Mr. Symes taught several young people the art of penmanship, Gladys among them." "You can't mean—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. Not Gladys. I mean the one who stood closest to her, who saw her struggle, who feared what the truth would do to her reputation. The girl's protector, her teacher. The one who signed no letter because she needed none. The colonel's eyes narrowed. You're talking about Mrs. Bartlett. Miss Marple nodded. She feared exposure for her husband's misdeeds, but her niece was the one who drew her into danger. When Gladys confided her suspicions that Symes had discovered missing funds, Mrs. Bartlett saw ruin ahead. So she acted, arranging the meeting behind the church, persuading the girl to carry the letter as bait. I dare say she meant only to frighten him, to retrieve the incriminating records. But when he fell, the rest followed as naturally as night after sunset. Melchett's jaw tightened. You think Mrs. Bartlett delivered the blow? No, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. That was indeed Gladys, an accident born of panic. But Mrs. Bartlett ensured that the opportunity existed. She told the girl where to meet him, what to say. And afterward, she took the parish ledgers, hid them, and let suspicion fall where it would. A woman of her sort, practical, fearful, would not risk exposure for murder, but she might for deceit. You see, Colonel, the sin was not in the blow, but in the silence that followed. There was a long pause. Somewhere nearby, the bell began its slow toll for evensong. Melchett exhaled. You're right, of course. You always are. We'll question her again. He hesitated, then added, It's remarkable, Miss Marple, how you can look at a web of lies and see where each thread began. She smiled faintly. It's only that human beings repeat themselves endlessly, Colonel. Every deceit I've seen in this village has an older cousin in another one. There's little new under the sun except the names. That evening, after Mrs. Bartlett had confessed, half sobbing, half defiant, that she had orchestrated the meeting and hidden the ledgers to protect her husband's name, Miss Marple returned home in quiet reflection. Justice, she thought, was rarely satisfying in its completion. Gladys would be spared the worst, but her life would carry the weight of one impulsive moment forever. Mrs. Bartlett would be shunned, not imprisoned, which in village life was punishment enough. And Mr. Symes, well, he had been a good man, but goodness alone seldom saves one from folly. As she entered her little cottage, the fire already set by her maid, she paused by the window. The snow had melted entirely, leaving the earth dark and damp. Across the lane, the church stood silent, its spire a shadow against the fading light. Miss Marple drew her shawl around her shoulders and sat down with her knitting. Outside, the wind stirred faintly, carrying the ghost of a hymn. She counted her stitches carefully, 2 knit, 1 pearl, and smiled to herself. So much drama, she murmured, and all beginning with a choir rehearsal. People never realize how dangerous music can be. The clock on the mantel struck 9, steady and solemn. The village had begun, at last, to quiet. And though Miss Marple's thoughts turned briefly to the faces that would not sing again, she found comfort in the small order of her evening routine. Human nature, she reflected, was always capable of tragedy, but also of mending. And in St. Mary Mead, mending was something everyone understood. The confession had quieted St. Mary Mead in the way thunder quiets a summer sky, noise followed by a strange, fragile calm. For several days afterward, the village behaved as though it were holding its breath. Doors closed softly, voices dropped to whispers, and even the clatter of teacups in the Blue Boar seemed muted. No one spoke of Arthur Symes directly, but his absence lingered everywhere, like a faint note struck in a hymn that refused to fade. Miss Marple, however, felt the unease beneath the stillness. Things did not quite sit right. The pattern of it, the chain of cause and consequence, was imperfect. Mrs. Bartlett's confession had satisfied Colonel Melchett. Gladys's remorse had softened the magistrate's heart. Yet to Miss Marple's eye, the shape of the truth remained oddly lopsided. She could not shake the sense that the story had tied itself up too neatly, that human nature, never tidy, had been forced into a box of convenient guilt. She sat one afternoon in her garden, trimming dead leaves from her primroses, when Dr. Haydock stopped at her gate. He carried a small leather case and wore that expression of half-suppressed curiosity reserved for those who knew Miss Marple was quietly working something out. "Thought I'd drop in," he said. "Melchett says it's all finished. Gladys cleared of malice, Mrs. Bartlett admitting to deception. But I can tell from that look of yours you're not content." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "It is a satisfactory conclusion, certainly. Yet satisfaction and truth are not always the same thing. Something still troubles me, Doctor. The matter of the letter itself." Haydock leaned against the gatepost. "What of it? The poor fellow wrote it, left it unsigned, and died before sending it. Melchett says the case is closed." "Ah," she murmured, but the ink told another tale. "I saw the letter before it was sealed in evidence, and I could not help noticing that the upper lines were darker than the rest. It suggests it was written in haste, perhaps after the pen had been freshly dipped. But the lower lines had faded inconsistently, as though copied from another hand." He frowned. Meaning, she said gently, "that the letter may not have been entirely Arthur Syme's own composition. Someone finished it for him." The doctor's brows rose. "Good Lord, you think he was already dying when it was written?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that he may have been coerced into writing it, or that someone intended to use his hand to shift suspicion elsewhere. Consider, Doctor, Mrs. Bartlett's confession was made only after the letter appeared. Had she known it existed, she would never have hidden it so carelessly. The letter came into being after Mr. Symes's death." Dr. Haydock straightened. "That's a serious charge. Who'd do such a thing?" "Someone with something to gain, and enough cleverness to see that a forged confession could quiet the village and the police alike. Someone whose position would suffer from scandal, yet who could not bear to see a friend's reputation ruined. I think," she said thoughtfully, "we have been looking too much at those who loved Arthur Symes, and too little at those who depended on him." Later that evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Reverend Clement. The vicar looked surprised but pleased, offering her a chair near the fire. His wife brought tea and retreated discreetly. "You'll think me inquisitive," Miss Marple began, "but I wonder if you ever saw the parish ledgers Mr. Symes kept before he died." "Only briefly," he said. "He mentioned reconciling them with the choir's expenses, some minor irregularities in the past." "Not so minor, I think," Miss Marple murmured. "And he confided in you about these matters?" The vicar hesitated. "In confidence, yes. He believed someone was still drawing small sums from the fund improperly. He suspected Mrs. Bartlett at first, but later he wasn't certain. I told him to let it rest until we could speak quietly with the churchwarden. That was the last conversation we had." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "And after his death, who took charge of the choir accounts?" "Why, Mr. Tupper, of course. He insisted on restoring order. He's been very diligent." "Too diligent, perhaps," she said softly. "When guilt grows old, it often disguises itself as virtue." The vicar looked startled. "Surely not Tupper. The man's insufferable, yes, but he's harmless." "Harmlessness is not always proof of innocence," Miss Marple replied. "Do you recall, Reverend, that it was his walking stick found near the body? We dismissed it because of the initials, but anyone could have taken it. Now that I think of it, there was a very particular smudge upon the silver band. A thumbprint, half wiped. It was on the left side." Reverend Clement leaned forward, the realization dawning slowly. "He's left-handed, you mean?" "No," said Miss Marple. "But he used his left hand when carrying his cane that morning. I saw it myself when he arrived. He claimed a twinge of rheumatism, a small detail, easily forgotten. But if he struck Symes in anger, perhaps to silence him when he threatened exposure, it would explain everything. The blow from the left, the letter forged later to frame Mrs. Bartlett, the eagerness to resume the choir as though nothing had happened. The vicar stared at her in dismay. "You're suggesting Tupper killed him deliberately?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "Deliberately? Perhaps not at first. People rarely set out to kill. I imagine it began with a quarrel. Symes confronting him about the missing funds, perhaps threatening to tell the bishop. Mr. Tupper, terrified of disgrace, struck out, only once, in panic. Then, realizing what he'd done, he arranged matters to implicate Mrs. Bartlett, whose past indiscretions made her a convenient scapegoat. Clever, yes, but not clever enough to fool time. Time always leaves its fingerprints. When she left the vicarage, the sky was streaked with twilight, the first star flickering faintly over the church spire. She walked the path home slowly, her mind turning over the final details. The next morning, Colonel Melchett arrived looking grim but vindicated. "You were right again," he told her. "We brought Tupper in early. He broke down before I'd said half a word. It was exactly as you said, an argument, a single blow, then panic. He forged the letter to save himself, using Symes's old stationery. Claimed he did it for the good of the parish." Miss Marple poured tea, her manner composed. "How very human," she said softly. "Murder seldom begins in evil, Colonel. It begins in vanity and fear and the foolish belief that one can tidy away a mistake like a blot on paper." Melchett nodded wearily. "He'll hang for it all the same." "I dare say," she murmured, "but I wonder if he ever truly meant harm. The saddest crimes, I think, are those committed by people who meant only to preserve appearances." When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking steadily. Outside, the faint sound of the church bell drifted through the window, marking another hour. The village would gossip for a time, then forget as villages do. But she, watching the flames dance over the hearth, knew that beneath every quiet Sunday and every polished hymn, human frailty hummed like a faint, unending note. She smiled faintly to herself and whispered, "The murder that stopped the choir." And yet perhaps it only silenced the wrong voices. For several days after Mr. Tupper's arrest, St. Mary Mead seemed to exist in a peculiar hush, like a drawing room after the guests have gone but before the maid has begun to clear away the cups. The villagers, relieved to have the murderer at last identified, nonetheless avoided the subject with the fastidious politeness peculiar to English country life. The choir was officially suspended, the vestry locked, and even the Reverend Clement's sermons took on an uneasy tone of reflection on sin, repentance, and the small temptations that can lead one astray. Miss Marple, however, remained as unruffled as ever. She accepted the colonel's formal gratitude with modest nods and declined any mention of heroism. "It wasn't heroism," she had said firmly when Mrs. Price Ridley attempted to praise her at the grocer's. "Merely observation. People reveal themselves whether they mean to or not." She had said it kindly, but the remark had the quiet finality of truth, and Mrs. Price Ridley had gone away slightly chastened, muttering about the danger of too much intelligence in elderly ladies. Yet even Miss Marple could not entirely shake the melancholy that lingered. Evil, when it touched a place like St. Mary Mead, left a faint residue behind, something that clung to hedgerows and doorways, invisible but perceptible to anyone with a sensitive heart. She sat one evening by her fire, the glow soft against the lace curtains, and thought of Arthur Symes. His courteous nods, his measured steps, his precise way of folding letters. There had been goodness in him, she reflected, goodness of a rather rigid sort, the kind that cannot bend without breaking. It was, perhaps, what had destroyed him. Dr. Haydock stopped by that evening with a small parcel of medicine for her rheumatism and found her in that contemplative mood. "Thinking of your choir murder, I suppose," he said, easing into a chair. "You've a look of someone reviewing her own evidence." "Not quite," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. "I was merely considering how very fragile morality is. We imagine it to be like granite, when in truth it's more like glass. A single crack, and it splinters all the way through." Haydock nodded thoughtfully. Tupper was a fool to think he could hide it. The man's been breaking down in his cell, I hear. Keeps insisting he didn't mean to kill Symes, that it was all a mistake. I dare say that's true, she murmured. But meaning well is not the same as doing right. A person can mean well and still destroy everything around them. Vanity, Doctor, is the most dangerous of the minor sins, because it so often masquerades as virtue. He chuckled. You sound as if you've seen it all before. Oh, but I have, she said gently. Many times and under gentler disguises. People don't change, Doctor. They only repeat themselves with new names. After he had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long while. Through the window she could see the faint flicker of lamplight from the vicarage and hear, very faintly, the sound of someone, perhaps Mrs. Clement, playing the organ, a slow, solemn tune that reminded her of the service yet to come. For there would be one more, of course, a service for Arthur Symes, to lay him finally to rest. It was to be simple, without choir, though the Reverend had asked Miss Marple if she might attend. For comfort, he had said. The day of the funeral dawned cold and pale, with a wind that scattered the last of the dead leaves along the church path. The villagers gathered in subdued clusters, their dark coats and muted whispers lending the morning a kind of reverent symmetry. Gladys Weatherby, pale and drawn, stood near the back, her eyes fixed on the coffin with a mixture of sorrow and relief. Mrs. Bartlett was not present. She had gone to stay with distant relatives for her health. Miss Marple stood slightly apart, observing, not out of detachment, but from habit. Observation, for her, was a form of prayer. Quiet, patient, and full of compassion. She watched the faces as the vicar spoke, the guilt that lingered in some, the morbid curiosity in others, the way certain heads turned at the mention of forgiveness. When the coffin was lowered, she caught the faintest murmur of wind passing through the birches by the lich gate, the same trees that had borne silent witness a week before. The sound was like a sigh, neither mournful nor forgiving, merely the indifferent breath of nature. After the service, Colonel Melchett joined her at the churchyard gate. A tidy ending, he said quietly. The sort of thing you like, eh, Miss Marple? Tidy, yes, she said. But endings are never quite so final as people believe. We close a book and imagine the story finished, yet the consequences, those go on turning their pages long after. He looked at her curiously. You think there's more to it? Not more crime, she said, shaking her head. But there is always more truth. Take poor Gladys. She'll bear this for years. Mrs. Bartlett, too. And the vicar will preach about forgiveness every Sunday now, I expect, because it comforts those who have witnessed something unforgivable. As for Mr. Tupper, well, the law will do its work, but I dare say he'll find his punishment began the moment he realized what he'd done. It's never the prison that condemns a man, Colonel. It's the memory. Melchett gave a brief nod. You've a strange comfort in you, Miss Marple. A harsh one, but steady. Perhaps it is only that I have seen so much of the same pattern, she said softly. Human nature is like embroidery, Colonel. The same stitches, over and over again. Love, pride, fear, deceit. Only the colors vary. As the mourners drifted away, she lingered for a final moment beside the grave. A robin hopped along the edge of the mound, bright against the dull earth. She bent slightly, adjusting a fallen sprig of holly on the wreath, and whispered, Rest now, Mr. Symes. You see, in the end, the truth was not lost, only delayed. The robin fluttered to the birch and sang a single, short note before flying off into the clear afternoon. Miss Marple straightened, her gloved hands folded before her. The world, she thought, would soon return to its familiar rhythm, gossip over tea, garden parties in spring, the hum of bees in the churchyard roses. Yet beneath it all, the same mysteries would continue, the quiet dramas of envy, affection, and pride, each waiting its turn to unfold. As she walked back toward her cottage, the bells began to toll again, gentle and deliberate, marking the hour. The sound followed her down the lane, neither mournful nor joyous, simply truthful, like life itself. And Miss Marple, hearing it, allowed herself the smallest smile. The choir might have stopped for now, but the village, in its infinite, imperfect way, would always find its voice again. The following weeks passed gently, as they always did in St. Mary Mead after a scandal. Time in the village, Miss Marple often thought, was like embroidery unpicked and stitched again. The pattern resumed its course, though never quite the same as before. The post office reopened under new management. Gladys Weatherby, under Miss Marple's discreet encouragement, had found employment in Bath and left the village quietly one morning, her eyes still shadowed, but her spirit not yet broken. Mrs. Bartlett's shop was shuttered, its window dusty, as though the past itself had drawn a curtain over it. Colonel Melchett visited one afternoon, less brisk than usual, carrying a folded newspaper under his arm. "It's all finished," he said after tea was poured. "The trial concluded this morning. Tupper confessed fully in the end. He'll not see another Easter." He hesitated, looking into the fire. "Strange thing, Miss Marple. He spoke of Arthur Symes almost fondly, as if he'd been a brother wronged, not a man he'd killed." Miss Marple looked into the flames, her knitting idle in her lap. "That is not so strange, Colonel. People rarely hate the ones they harm. More often they pity them or even love them, just a little too much in the wrong way. I imagine Mr. Tupper's remorse was genuine, but remorse, you know, comes too late to be of much use." Melchett nodded, the weight of the affair still upon him. "He said something about voices," he added quietly. "That the choir's music haunted him, that he'd only wanted to preserve harmony. Foolish words, perhaps, but it struck me oddly." Miss Marple gave a small sigh. "Not foolish at all. You see, Colonel, Mr. Tupper believed himself the conductor of life here, the one who kept everyone in time and key. When Arthur Symes threatened that order, it wasn't hatred that drove him, but fear. He thought he could correct a false note by force. But life is not music, and human beings are never perfectly in tune. Poor man, he mistook control for virtue." Outside, the wind stirred through the garden, setting the last of the ivy to rustling against the window pane. The firelight wavered, and for a moment Miss Marple's gaze softened, almost wistful. "Do you know," she said gently, "it reminds me of the Henderson affair years ago. So much striving to maintain appearances. When one builds one's worth upon the opinion of others, one becomes terribly fragile. That, I think, was Mr. Tupper's tragedy, and perhaps, in smaller ways, the village's too." Melchett smiled faintly. "You see patterns in everything, Miss Marple." She returned the smile. "That's because people make patterns, Colonel. Their follies repeat like verses of a hymn. Only the refrain changes." He left soon after, his boots crunching down the lane, and Miss Marple sat alone for a long while, the ticking clock filling the quiet. Her thoughts wandered to those left behind, the vicar, still preaching forgiveness, Dr. Haydock, who spoke more softly now when mentioning guilt, Gladys, far away in a new town, learning perhaps that innocence could grow again if tended with care. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, now subdued in manner, had stopped declaring the downfall of society at every turn. It was curious, Miss Marple thought, how a single act of violence could teach a village to behave more kindly, at least for a little while. She rose and went to her window, drawing aside the curtain. The church stood still and pale under the evening sky, the steeple catching the last faint light. From within, she could just make out the vicar's wife practicing at the organ, tentative chords filling the dusk. The notes wavered, unsteady yet full of yearning, like a wounded thing learning how to breathe again. Miss Marple smiled. "They will sing once more," she murmured. "They always do." That night, as the clock struck 9, she sat by the fire and took up her knitting once more. The wool slipped softly through her fingers, the rhythm of the needles matching the calm, deliberate beat of her thoughts. Somewhere beyond the window, a robin began to sing, bright against the darkness. Miss Marple listened, her expression serene. The world, she knew, would continue to turn in its quiet, flawed way. There would always be secrets beneath smiles, pride hidden beneath piety, kindness shadowed by fear. Yet within all that imperfection, there remained something tender, something redeemable. She folded her knitting at last and looked toward the fire, its light flickering warm against her gentle, knowing face. "Human nature," she said softly, almost to herself, "is never simple. But if one understands it, if one truly listens, why, there's very little that cannot be set right." Outside, the last notes of the organ faded into stillness. The air of St. Mary Mead settled once again into its ordinary peace. The choir would return in time, the hymns would rise anew, and life, with all its little tragedies and quiet triumphs, would go on. Miss Marple smiled faintly, poured herself a final cup of tea, and whispered, as if to the quiet village beyond her window, "Good night, my dears. All's well again."